Hi, I'm James Udy. I'm the Director of Science Under Sail, and I'll be giving the guest lecture today in the Global Challenge in Biology series, lecture number 26 on sustainable utilisation of species. Let me just share my screen with you and hope we'll get underway. All right, so hopefully now you've got the slide in the middle of your screen and you've got me off to one side. If it doesn't work, I'm going to find out in an hour and I'm going to have to redo this. So yeah, as I said before, it's lecture number 26, Sustainable Utilisation of Species. Bernard is your normal lecturer, but I'm guest lecturing this one just to help out and also to get a chance to say hi to everyone and meet you in case you ever want to come on a future Science Under Sail trip. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a minute, but let me just get moving through this lecture series. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was have everybody say what you know about sustainability now. So before we've even started the lecture, what do you already think? When I say sustainability, write down an example of something that you believe is sustainable and something, maybe an example of something that's happened that you're aware of that you didn't think was done in a sustainable way. And then we'll move on. So just get a pen and paper, pause the thing if you need to, and just write down what your view of sustainability is. And clearly, sustainable management of environmental ecosystems would be ideal. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. So the outcomes that I'm aiming for today's lecture are, one, to understand what sustainable actually means and be able to evaluate if certain human activities are sustainable or not sustainable. So I'll be interested to have you, at the end of your lecture, look back at those notes you've just written and see if I've added to your knowledge around sustainability. Understand the difference between sustainable and ethical. That's a theme that's going to pop up probably throughout this lecture series. So some things can be ethical, but potentially not sustainable, although there is a close link if you look at intergenerational ethics, in that, is it ethical for us to take all the Earth's resources and not leave any for your generation or your children's generation? And then finally, the recognizing the difference between natural resources and how they relate to ecosystem services. And the understanding why population ecology is relevant. Clearly, sustainability and harvesting have a strong link, although hopefully at the end of my lecture, you'll actually feel like there's more to managing for sustainability than just managing the harvesting, which is really the take. So harvesting is the rate at which you remove something from the environment. And hopefully at the end of my lecture, you'll have a feeling that there's actually more to managing sustainability than just managing how much we take from the environment. Okay, who am I? I guess you're about to listen to me on a recording for an hour, so you might want to know a little bit about my background and where I came from and what my experiences are. So firstly, I started my university degree at University of Sydney many years ago, and I did Bachelor of Science honours, and interestingly enough, well before coral bleaching was ever heard of, I studied the interaction between coral and zooxanthellae, which are the little symbiotic algae that get expelled when a coral bleaches. Then after a little bit of travelling, I came back to University of Queensland and I did a PhD on seagrass, and more specifically, the interaction between seagrass and nutrients. Then I left marine for a while and went to Griffith University, where I worked as a postdoc in the Australian Rivers Institute, still looking at nutrients, but looking at the impact of nutrients on freshwater ecosystems. So what did it do as far as algal blooms and toxic algal blooms, and how did it affect food webs of freshwater ecosystems when you overloaded or added too much nutrient to that ecosystem? Then I actually returned as a lecturer to the Centre for Marine Studies in the University of Queensland, so quite close to where you guys are studying now, and co-managed the marine botany group for several years, before moving to the School of Engineering. And I think I was probably the first biologist to actually work at the School of Engineering as a lecturer and research associate. And I established a group of biological researchers there that looked at ecosystem processes and how they were affected by environmental variables, and really worked closely with the modelers there to help them build better environmental models that help us predict for any given human impact what the outcome might be. Finally, after that, I moved and became the manager of SEQ Water's research and development team. This was around the same time that we were talking about putting recycled water back into Ivanhoe Dam. So it was a very interesting time. And I guess it gave me another 5 years looking at the world through freshwater ecosystems and how you manage freshwater ecosystems to ensure that we as humans have the resources we need to live. And so that's water for producing food and also water for drinking was the main focus there. And then, of course, my passion's always been marine. So when the opportunity came up, jumped back into the marine habitats and became chief scientist for Healthy Waterways. Now changed its name to Healthy Land and Water. And they put the organisation that produces the report card each year on the health of the waterways of Southeast Queensland. And most recently, now work for myself as the Director of Science Under Sail, which is really an education organisation that does experience-based learning. And I also do consultancy work for places like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and Australian Institute of Marine Science, as well as locally with Healthy Land and Water. So enough about myself, but they're my background. And if you have an interest or you get involved with Science Under Sail in the future, that's just a little bit about myself. So today's lecture is really about sustainability and understanding the multi-facets of sustainability. The challenge for us as humans, where we at the moment is we're on a globe, the globe's population is continuing to increase. COVID-19 may be doing a little bit to slow that increase, but ultimately we still have a lot of, on a population trajectory where each year we have more people than we had the previous year. So that's a real challenge when you've got limited resources, because every human being needs a certain amount of resources in their lifetime. And so if we as a single species continue to take resources away from the world and the earth, there's going to be a limit at which we can't actually produce enough resources to sustain all the human beings that live on the planet. So how do we understand this problem? How do we grapple with this problem? And how ultimately do we find a solution? So some relevant questions that are worth thinking about. If you want to pause the video at this point and think about these questions yourself before I go into detail, it often helps to remind yourself that you already have a lot of knowledge personally yourself. So while the lecture can help add to that knowledge, it's good to acknowledge the background knowledge that you come to this lecture and this course with. So the first one's, why is ecology relevant to sustainable resource use? Well, hopefully that's a little bit evident in itself, but if you don't understand the ecology, which is the way the resources interact to produce things that we want, you aren't going to be able to actually effectively manage the resource. Do we need to know about species and populations before understanding harvest? I'd actually say we do, because if you just keep taking, but you don't know how fast the species are replenished and how important it is to have different ages or sexes of species available to actually maintain the supply, you potentially end up getting in a situation like many Australians experienced recently with toilet paper, where the rate at which we were taking toilet paper off the shelves was much faster than the rate at which the supermarkets were putting it back on the shelves. So we had almost total loss of toilet paper. Now, in that case, if the toilet paper on the supermarket had been the adults and needed to reproduce to give us new toilet paper rolls, we would have been in a very serious situation, because there would have been no way to get more toilet paper. In our situation, because it's a manufactured product that has no relationship to the toilet paper that was in the supermarket, we were able to restock those shelves and make new toilet paper. But I think that's a good analogy just to remember when you're talking about ecosystems, is if we take too much, especially if and we have to know at what point of the life cycle we're taking to know how we're affecting the rest of the life cycle. So why do some fisheries collapse and others don't? Well, hopefully that analogy of the toilet paper gives you a bit of an idea and an insight and a way to look at different fish species and fisheries and predict perhaps if some are going to be successful fisheries and some are likely to collapse. What factors influence populations' ability to recover from harvest? Once again, it's understanding of that life cycle, what stage of the life cycle is necessary for reproduction, and what other environmental attributes are also necessary. So it's not just about the individuals in the population, but they live in some sort of ecosystem, and their health, well-being, and ability to reproduce will vary depending on the other attributes of that ecosystem. So it's actually, you sometimes hear these days about ecosystem, sustainable ecosystem management. And besides improving harvesting approaches, what else can we do to conserve fish populations? So this talk's very focused on marine and fisheries, because that's, I guess, a place where we still rely predominantly on the natural ecosystems to provide the food and the protein that we get from fish. In most other forms of protein, humans have domesticated the animals. So a very small amount of the world's protein comes from, say, hunting natural animals compared to what comes from harvesting of beef cattle. But in fish, it's the other way around. The majority of our fish come from natural ecosystems, and we just take from that, and hopefully the ecosystem maintains itself so it can keep producing, whereas we still have aquaculture moving, but it's still proportionally much smaller than the cattle industry and the beef industry. So I think now is also a time when you could pause it if you wanted and do a bit of a Google search on sustainability just to see what you get. These are two images that I got when I Google searched for images. So on the left, you can obviously see the world being held in cupped hands and sort of looked after, I guess what it's trying to pursue. And yes, sustainability is protecting what we already have. And then on the right, you can see a lot of different words that pop up at the same time as sustainability or parallel to it. So responsible fishing, recycling, renewables, looking after the environment and water, conserving, various words like that. Things you can do, actions you can take, like ride a bike, rooftop meadows. So looking for everywhere where you can actually help to return or protect something that we as humans often overutilize. Probably the best summary of that. Excuse me. Endurance of system and process. So sustainability is actually the fact that the system or the processes, and normally we're only interested in if there's a perceived benefit to humans, but it's the process or the system continuing to function in a way that it can provide that service or that benefit to us, is the anthropogenic way of looking at sustainability. You can have a more open sustainability in that you would be protecting all the world's processes and systems for the good of all plants and animals, bacteria and viruses in the world. But to be honest, most people don't think of it that way. We're very anthropogenic in that we tend to think of what's in it for me, what's in it for us. And it's sustainability management is normally around trying to make sure that the ecosystems, processes, and systems that produce things that are beneficial for human society aren't damaged to the point that they stop to produce. On a more specific thing, it's harvesting or using a resource so that the resource is not depleted and permanently damaged. Okay. So once again, here's the concept of the cupped hand. So what's a natural resource as opposed to So if you're going to use your natural resources sustainably, then you need to think about, well, what do I mean by a natural resource? And here, this photo has quite a few of them shown. There's the wind turbines showing the wind. Obviously, the whole piece of Earth is drenched in sunlight, which is a natural resource in itself, an energy source. You've got green plants and lawns there, taking that green energy source and turning it into a food resource. And then there's lots of animals there. There's a fish, there's birds, there's a city in the distance. And all of those need clean air for us to breathe and water for us to drink and stay hydrated. And all those things actually appear there. That you don't, at first, it just sort of looks like a pretty picture of a hand, but I think if you look in detail at that, you should be able to find lots of different natural resources. Even on the far left, I can see a little sailboat that I'm very fond of. And so that's a recreational resource. To have a waterway and a place to go sailing safely is a resource for my mental health and my well-being. So what's a natural resource? So very generically, all that exists without the actions of humankind. So there's nothing we have to do to make a natural resource. It's there for the taking by, I guess, previous generations of humans thought the natural resources were there, and if you could put in the effort or the energy to take them and turn them into a product that was useful to you as a human, it was almost as a right assumption that you were allowed to take that resource and use it. So when populations were much smaller in the world, that concept, the natural resources were limitless, obviously led to a lot of the foundational beliefs in our society. And I guess that's what we're really grappling with now, is the fact that these natural resources are no longer limitless, and we have to start managing as though there's a finite amount of them, in the same way you manage money in your bank account. There's only so much money in your bank account. If you buy 10 times as much stuff as what you can afford to pay for, something's going to happen to you that's not nice in the future. And the same is with our natural resources. We have all these resources, but if we keep pulling money out of our bank account faster than it's going in, we're not going to manage to have a balanced bank account in the future. And that's, I guess, really the crux of sustainability, is how do you keep that bank balance at the same or higher level than what it was before while continuing to spend. So finally, this really important before we move on, I guess, is that understanding of non-renewable resources and renewable resources. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the non-renewables because you can't really use them sustainably. You can use them in an ethical way. You can use them slowly so they last longer. There's many ways you can manage the use of them, but at the end of the day, non-renewable resources are going to run out. So the only thing you can do with those is recycle them. And that's fossil fuels, soil, and minerals. To some extent, soil does replenish itself with erosion and weathering of rock. But for argument's sake, in this lecture, let's just stick to the simplistic, which is those things are there. If you lose them, they're very hard to replace. They're not things you can just go and wait a little while and they'll come back. The renewable resources are things like water, wind, solar energy in the physical world, and then plants and animals, and that includes also bacteria. So first of all, we'll focus on the water, wind, and solar. I don't know how many of you are aware, but actually a lot of people believe the next world war may well be fought over water. That were obviously in the past, oil and fuel and those energy things were much higher value, but already now we're finding that people are having to pay very large amounts of money for water, and without water you can't sustain human life, and you can't grow the food you need to give you a longer life expectancy than a few days. So it's really that ability to manage water in a sustainable way that's becoming a real crux of, I guess, sort of the Earth's focus for especially those of us in the water industry, I guess, understand how critical the problem is. And you may or may not be aware, but actually just locally here in the 2011 floods, or 2013 floods, I think it was, we came within a few hours of running out of water. That's the city of Brisbane. And that wasn't due to lack of water because we were in floods. It was because the water was so dirty and had so much sediment in it that the water treatment plants collapsed and they couldn't keep up with demand. And so basically it got to the stage where there was only just enough water left in the pipes for the supply, and they were starting to put in place ways to basically bringing water up from Sydney and Melbourne to try to sustain the Brisbane population. So it is, as well as the absolute amount of water, which is critically short in many places in the world, there's also this issue of the quality of the water and whether it's fit for human consumption. So there's just, so the types of industries, I guess, that rely on these different things is fossil fuels, soil and minerals is the mining and the agricultural industry. The water, the wind and the solar is really our water management, renewable energies, and the plants and animals is harvesting from natural. So today's lecture will be focusing on that bottom one, the harvesting from natural ecosystems, more so than the agriculture. So this is just a quick example of the non-sustainable one. So you can see their graph at the bottom shows the number of years of oil left in the world, and we can't replenish this resource, so we can spend more money and put more energy into getting more difficult oil reserves, which is why to some extent that line goes up and down, because it depends how valuable the resource is, how much effort we put into harvesting it. But at the moment, for quite a period of time, so over a decade, really we've been assuming we have around 50 years of oil supply, and then there won't be any more oil. So whether you believe in climate change or not, at the end of the day, the world has to find another energy source, because 50 years isn't that long. You know, you guys will probably be in your 70s when that happens, and I may not be with us, but it's definitely in our lifespan. There's a lot of people at the moment who will be alive in 50 years' time, when whether, you know, if we don't cut back on our use of oil reserves, we'll run out. And that assumes current use, whereas actually use is accelerating. So it's quite likely that oil reserves will run out in 30 or 40 years based on the increased demand that was happening before COVID-19. Okay, phosphorus is another really critical non-renewable resource that I just want to touch on here. It's one of the key elements of all biological systems. So no matter what animal or plant you are, you need phosphorus. And that's because it's part of DNA and ATP, which are both sort of biochemical things. Hopefully you know what both of them are. So P in the soil comes from the underlying rocks, and it's depleted in older soils. So the younger the soil, so Western Australia and Australia generally has very, very low phosphorus. So our farmers tend to fertilize with superphosphate to get better, improved crop yield. P needs to be topped up in fertilizers, as I said, and then we get P fertilizers by mining phosphate rock or guano, which is basically just seabird droppings or bat droppings. And actually, but it's actually quite rare on the world scale, and there's been a lot of studies that look at the time when the phosphorus will be depleted. So just some interesting things, I guess, to mention here. So rainforests need a lot of phosphorus, but they get a lot of it from recycling, but also they often grow in younger soils that have much higher phosphorus concentrations. Here's a shot of Western Australia, which is basically showing some Australian natives that are incredibly good at scavenging phosphorus, because Australia as a continent has such low phosphorus because of our age. And one interesting there is that's how you can kill a lot of natives, is by putting phosphorus-rich fertilizer on them. And because they don't have a way of not taking up too much, because they're grown and developed in habitats that have not enough phosphorus, they actually can overdose on phosphorus. And crop areas here are basically looking at so West Australian wheat belt produces about 40% of Australia's wheat and is home to about 20% of Australia's sheep. And yet here we have a fairly low phosphorus environment, but here this wheat would have been stimulated with phosphorus enrichment and fertilizers. Okay, so where do you get your phosphorus from if it's such a rare element and it's so critical to habitats? That's one example is Nauru, which is basically just a big phosphorus rock, probably from age-old guano. And basically its major economy used to be harvesting of the phosphorus. It's now, let me just, you can see from the photo, I guess it's quite a destructive process, and it's great environmental harm. That the bottom, that's actually not doing that so much anymore, but now the country's basically supported by Australia, sending detainees over there who try to come in by boat. So we support their economy in a different way now. So, and I guess there is a move around the world, and I think some early thinkers, I guess, and people have realized in the same way that oil is going to run out, phosphorus is going to run out. And because phosphorus is so important for agriculture and growing basically any plant matter that we want to grow, there are people in the world now trying to recycle and reuse the phosphorus that we have. And this example's a photo taken of a basically sewage wastewater treatment plant that tries to recycle the phosphorus back into fertilizers. It's happening already in Sweden and Germany. I know from traveling around Europe years ago, there was a lot of farmers that used to put out, they just spread the sewage on their fields. So it's a much more primitive way of doing it. Stinks, but it is effective, and they obviously grow good crops from it. And at the moment, it's still cheaper to mine the rock, though, than it is to do some of these recycling plants, which is why they haven't been taken on so thoroughly. Okay, so where could we be going? Oh, sorry, I thought I was talking to this slide. So this is the recycling one I thought I was talking to. And yeah, we'll move on. So where could we be going? Well, we may have to move to a much more local recycling scheme where, we harvest our rainwater rather than treating that rainwater that falls in our cities as wastewater and trying to get rid of it, or stormwater. We might even have to take over some of our space in our larger units and high rises to produce food. In this case, they've used trees to try and put oxygen back in the air and take up the carbon dioxide, but also you could use it to produce your productive food. So this is just a cartoonist idea of, I guess, what might happen. But then there's actually buildings like this already starting to appear. So this one's in Vienna in Austria, where you can see a lot of the ideas in that previous cartoon being brought to life. So this would be considered a sustainable urban building, in that it's trying to bring back a lot of the ecological processes that have been lost by creating an urban environment. There's a whole lecture I can give you on that, but I won't today. The other, they're potentially sustainable renewable resources. So renewable resources are those that will replenish themselves, but you still have to manage the rate at which you take from them, and also how your other activities affect them, because you can have a negative impact on your renewable resources that actually slows down the rate of supply. Water is a good one, in that by deforesting, you actually reduce the amount of evaporation going up into clouds, and thereby you reduce your rainfall. So if, as a community, you're reliant on a certain amount of rain falling in your catchment to either water your crops or give you drinking water, but you go and cut down the forests around your community, you actually are creating a little desert environment around that community and not providing the water back up to the atmosphere to produce the rain. And there's a lot of studies that have been shown on this, so I won't go into further detail. But if you're interested in that, investigate the effect and the usefulness of vegetation to actually stimulate rain, or sometimes it's referred to as microclimates, to change the microclimate. So the important things here, I guess, are that the rate of resource extraction is slower than the rate of replenishment. And if the food webs and habitats are important at all stages of the life cycle, remain functional. So really, to do things in a renewable and sustainable way, you need to understand the whole process of if it's an animal, it's the life cycle. If it's water, it's the water cycle. You've got to understand the full cycle and make sure that humans aren't changing something at any point in that cycle that's having a detrimental impact. I think that trees and reducing evaporation that then leads to clouds and rain is a good one for the water cycle. And obviously understanding reproductive rates as well as growth rates and survival rates are all important when you're talking about animals and plants. So the living renewable resources are those we can harvest and or we convert natural systems to agricultural systems and farm them. So today I'm going to skip over the farming side of things and just focus on the natural. So how do these renewable resources relate to the ecosystem services? So I'm going to put this wheel up that hopefully many of you have seen before. Basically, it breaks up all the things that humans need and use that the earth produces into 4 main categories. So there's provisioning, so it's providing us with things we need to support life. So that's clean water, fish, wood, pollination, cool temperatures. Then there's regulation, so the modifying of our environments to make them either be good that we can survive or just more palatable to us. So there's cleaning of the water, there's storing of the carbon, there's cleaning the air, and then there's the cultural and the supporting. So photosynthesis, biodiversity are supporting, and cultural, recreation, aesthetics, those sorts of things are in the cultural. So in that red now, you should see the living or natural resources, and they're mainly the provisioning services, so fish, vegetables, and water. However, sustainability of these natural resources depends on supporting and regulating services. E.g., soil is contaminated, we can no longer farm vegetables. So these are the yellow ones, I guess, are the supporting services or the regulating services that we need to actually support the others. So so basically sustainable agriculture, as I said, I'm not going to go into. There's a few points there you can focus on, but I'm going to jump right into the natural processes. So here I'm going to focus for the rest of this lecture on sustainable harvesting of our natural resources, not agriculture. So the definition that largest amount of harvest activity that can occur without degrading the productivity of the stock. So this is very much of a take mentality. And I think I've worked a lot with indigenous cultures. Indigenous cultures are very good at understanding the ecosystems they work with. But from my experience, and maybe that some indigenous cultures vary with this, when you look deeply at them, because they've rarely had the populations to push populations to extinction as we have as Western people and populations have grown, indigenous culture knowledge often relates to how do you maximize your harvest while minimizing your take. So definitely in the Solomons, one of the traditional knowledges there is around fish spawning habitats. And obviously, if you want to catch lots of fish to feed yourself and your village, and you don't want to spend a lot of time doing it, then going to a fish spawning or aggregation site where there's lots of fish and their minds are on other things is a really good time to catch your fish. So a lot of the traditional harvesting of fish in the Solomons happens during these events, which are natural events in the life cycle of the various marine animals. and there are times when I guess those marine populations are most vulnerable. If you're limiting your take to the level where you're not threatening the continuation of that population, that's not a problem. However, nowadays with the added Western harvesting techniques, whether it be big trawlers or massive tuna boats or other ways of just extracting large amounts of marine animals from the ecosystems, we've switched the balance. And so now, of course, and some of the work I've done in the Solomons is trying to convince Solomon Islanders who traditionally would use these fish aggregations as a way to harvest and easily capture fish for their families, to try to get them to stop doing that. Now, the concerning thing is it's often not their fault that in the first place their fish populations are crashing. It can often be an outside influence that has led to that fish population crashing, but now they're faced with not only a reducing fish resource, and therefore they need to spend more time capturing the fish that they rely on to give their families protein, but we're also asking them to not harvest in the most efficient way possible, because we believe as Western scientists that just allows for them to potentially push the population to a point at which it can't reproduce and sustain itself. So there's a lot of interesting things here, and I'm going to just touch on, I guess, the three elements of sort of sustainable management of ecosystems rather than just the harvest and take of populations, hopefully today. So sustainable harvesting is all about managing what? Okay, well, it's managing the population, but it's not just the population, it's the ecosystem around that population. So it's the habitats that that animal live in as well as the population. Okay, the population is a thing that we use as a meter for knowing, I guess, how we're going, because if the population's going down, that's not a good sign. If the population's stable or going up, we're normally pretty happy. Whales are a good example where every year there's more whales than there was the year before. So I'd argue in most cases, we're probably doing a reasonable job now with managing whale populations, although different species have different threats. So a better definition is the number of individuals we can take from a population and the frequency we can take them without reducing the capacity of the population to recover. Okay, so for example, you know, it might be 1,000 individuals a year, or it might be a kilo weight, but it's putting some sort of limit on the rate at which we can take animals out of that population. Now that will depend on the rate at which new animals are coming into that population, and that's often referred to as recruitment. So the rate at which new animals join a population or enter a population, often or as they become adult. The other thing is growth rate. So if you have a really healthy ecosystem, and so the animal or the plant that you're interested in grows incredibly fast, you might need less individuals. So that's, as you can see, the example, there's 1,000 individuals. But if you have 1,000 big individuals, then to get the same amount of protein or nutrients from those, you might only need to eat 800. And the reverse is also true, that if you have very small individuals, you might need 1,500. So it's not as simple as just individuals. It's understanding the sort of the protein and nutrients that you can extract, and the rate of growth of the individual or the population you're interested in, as well as the recruitment success, is critical. Okay, so what do we need to know? So population size is obviously going to be important. How certain are we about a population's estimate? So estimating population size, invariably humans are pretty poor at, especially when they want to take from it. They'll often overestimate their population size or not realize that the populations are declining as fast as they are until sometimes it's too late. Rate of population increase. So you've got to return that ability to recover and ability to replace yourself. And then the rate of harvest. So how, especially at a societal community level, sometimes knowing how much everybody cumulatively is collecting is challenging. So in our system, you know, commercial fisheries, you've got prawn fishermen, you've got trawlers, you have line fishermen. Now, Department of Fisheries puts all that information together and gets estimates based on the fisheries logbooks. But still, there's probably some error in each logbook, and there's cumulatively then you may or may not be predicting the take at a state level or a national level as well as you might hope to. So there's a lot of assumptions and uncertainties in that fisheries management strategy. But as I said, I can't really go into all the fisheries stuff. A lot of these slides are almost a topic and a lecture in themselves. So orange roughy is just an example of one fishery that's very difficult to manage, would have been very difficult to manage. It's been managed rather poorly. And obviously it's a fish that people like to eat. So and you can see the photo there on the bottom left, you know, they're hauling in large quantities of orange roughy. Once we got the technology in the boats that allowed us to harvest them, because they're a deep water fish, you know, it seemed like a dream fishery with just unlimited supplies. But then when we started to understand the biology a little bit better, we realized that these fishes live for more than 100 years. So they're very slow growing. They don't even mature until they're 30. So if you have to live until you're 30 years old before you can reproduce yourself, and a fisherman comes along when you're 25, too bad, you're not going to help contribute to that population growth or sustainability. Very low natural mortality. So they didn't, while there was large biomass, they were very slow to die, and therefore they didn't need a very fast recovery to sustain a healthy population. When we came at the far end and actually started taking faster than the inputs, of course, you had and also slow growth rates. So all those things I touched on before. And so this is what's happened across the world. You can see all the different countries that have had orange roughy fisheries, and you can see pretty much, you know, in the 1970s is when people started fishing it. New Zealand was one of the early ones, and actually they're probably the ones that managed reasonably better than others. But you can see Australia had a real peak in the 1990s, and then it's almost crashed to like 1/5 of what it used to be in the height of the fishing. But all of these things where we take faster than it can replenish, and then eventually we actually have an impact on the replenishment rate because we're taking the reproductive adults. Another example is southern bluefin tuna. They not as long lived as the orange roughy, but they live for more than 30 years, and they take 10 to 12 years to mature. They grow to a very large fish, but once again have very slow growth rates. And so the Japanese, as well as other countries' desire to eat these fish has meant that there's a great financial incentive in catching and harvesting them. And an individual fish can feed a lot of people, but unfortunately the rate at which we're able to eat these fish is much faster than the rate at which they can reproduce themselves. So initially what's happened is the size of the fish that are caught has got smaller and smaller, and now of course just the total fishery is much smaller. So you can see in the 70s and 80s there, the catch per 1,000 tons was sort of up around 40 to 50. Now you're lucky if you're even getting 20. Sort of most of the catches are under 20. And once again, it comes in this issue of what's actually a sustainable catch. So there's two examples of long-lived animals with relatively slow growth rates that have been, while they were a biomass, like before they were harvested, they appeared to be an endless biomass of fish that we could take. But then once we started harvesting, we realized they weren't replenishing themselves as fast as we could take them. And so we've had to put more and more managements in place to try and make those fisheries sustainable, albeit at a much lower level of production. Another fishery that is much better at, I guess, at maintaining a harvest is the calamari, southern calamari squid. Now, one reason why it is better is it has a very short lifespan. So it lives for less than a year, it matures at about 9 months, and has internal fertilization. So basically, it can actually reproduce itself very fast, and so we can afford to take, because there's a very rapid replenishment of that. Every year, that population has to totally replace itself. So as long as we are harvesting after the reproduction's occurred, it's likely that that whole population will come back within a year if we take the adults after they've spawned and had reproduction. So that actually appears to be easier. So it's really the short-lived species that I guess we're better at harvesting than the long-lived, slow-growing species. Another one I was going to touch on here, I know we're getting to the end of the lecture, and so I'm going to try and finish this fairly quickly, but my daughter did her master's on the effect of kelp in supporting fisheries. So just brings in the fact, the importance of the food web here briefly, rather than just the take. So even if you have a sustainable take, but something happens to the food production, you can have a serious impact. So this is a very complicated slide on food web. You can look at it later, but I'm not going to go through it straight away now. But it basically shows that there's two forms of food webs. There's one based on phytoplankton, and there's one based on kelp and macroalgae. Now, she found that the fish biomass in two areas of New Zealand were quite different. In Marlborough, which is an area on the northern part of the Southern Island, and actually a place where Captain Cook said there was abundant fish back when he saw it, even to the state where I think in one of his logs he mentioned it was almost as though you could walk on water. Like there were so many fish in the water, you could have got out of your boat and stepped from fish to fish and not fallen into the water. However, now there's much lower fish biomasses there than there is in fjordland. So she said about trying to understand why that is, and there we have basically one of the differences. Now, obviously, it's hard to go back 100 or 200 years before Western immigration to New Zealand and before the large-scale changes in catchment runoff and vegetation. But on the left there, you can see Marlborough Sound with very heavily cleared landscapes, and now very, very little kelp forests, very few kelp forests. On the right-hand side, you have the southern fjordland with much more extensive natural vegetation, cleaner water, and healthy kelp forests. And it appears that that kelp is a really important input of energy and fixed carbon to the food webs of these commercially and recreationally valued fish species. So there's a paper down there if you want to read it, but it's really important to think of the food web and the supporting. So that's an element of growth, that even if the same number of fish come back to a population, if they don't have the food resources that allow them to grow fast, then you won't be able to harvest as much. And that some of Jaquetta's work has shown that the fish in the kelp forests actually do appear to have faster growth rates, as well as potentially better recruitment. Okay, another one I want to talk about here. So this isn't so much about harvesting as just understanding sustainability, and it's dugongs, turtles, and seagrass. So in Australia anyway, unless you're indigenous, you don't harvest turtles or dugongs for food. So this is an example where the majority of the population is not eating these animals, and yet they're still listed as vulnerable or threatened in many ways. So why is that? Well, partially because it's harvesting in other parts. So turtles and dugongs can migrate outside of Australian waters, especially turtles can. But the other is the food resource, once again. So seagrass is there on the slide. That would be a meadow that both dugongs and turtles would enjoy eating. And definitely in the sort of lead up to the 2011 floods in Brisbane, the Great Barrier Reef coastline had several years of above average rainfall and above average runoff, which led to a decline in the seagrass along the Great Barrier Reef coastline. And that has led to both turtles and dugongs increase in their death. And then when they did the autopsies, they found that the dugongs and turtles were exhibiting symptoms similar to starvation. So they think that the lack or the loss of reduction in seagrass habitat actually meant that these animals, while not being harvested, were potentially dying from starvation. So that the environment did not have enough food resources to carry that population. And so without killing them directly for food, we were actually leading to their death in other ways. And I think when you think about sustainability, it's important to think in that more holistic fashion. Final example here that I wanted to share with you is the world travelers. Now, these guys can travel without the airlines, which is probably lucky, because who knows when we'll next get to get on a plane and travel outside Australia's borders. But these are the wader birds that travel extensively across the Earth's surface. So just to give you an example, here's this little guy here, 7327, and he departed Flinders on the 4th of May, or they put a geolocator on him in April, departed from Flinders on the 4th of May, and then he went to Taiwan, and then departed Taiwan after about 2 weeks of stocking up on food reserves, and eventually made it up to the Arctic, and which is the breeding grounds, and then they lost the signal in June, so they don't know where he ended up after that. But it shows the scale of that's one migration, and they do this annually. So it's quite an excessive thing for these animals. Basically, in a lifetime, they'll go the equivalent distance, I think, from here to the moon. So it's really quite amazing thing. And once again, nobody eats these animals, so it's not a harvest issue, but we do have population declines across these species. One example is the loss of estuarine tidal flats, where we think about 20% of the population of great knots used to feed, and now there's been a reduction in great knots seen in Australia. So this is an example of where potential changes outside a nation have an impact on those animals that migrate between nations. And so, you can talk more about that at other lectures probably. And then one last thing is climate change and its impact on these animals, but lots of other animals too. So these are just an example, I guess, but something to consider when you're talking about sustainability is a lot of our sustainable models and a lot of our assumptions for take or harvest are based on historical documents and historical records of growth or, And so a lot of the times we base our assumptions on the past to predict what we are able to do in the future. But with climate change, that's not always going to be the case. And in this case, you've got the snow is actually starting to melt in the Arctic earlier than it used to. That is then leading to peak food abundance. So spiders and larvae and things no longer coming in to their maximum before the birds arrive. Then the birds are arriving, and but then by the time they have the chicks, the food resource is largely been depleted. And so what you end up with is a lot of hungry chicks who don't have enough food to get through and develop the energy they require to then fly and start the migration. And of course, you can't stay in the Arctic over winter. So if you don't have the food reserves you need to leave and come back to the Southern Hemisphere, you're likely to be frozen and die. The issue is that those two used to be coincided. So the snow used to melt at the right time, that once the birds had arrived, the peak food resource would occur. So that the birds themselves actually had adapted to work around the cycles that existed in the earth. But as these cycles change, at the moment, a lot of animals that do, especially the migratory animals, aren't able to adapt or aren't adapting their migratory patterns fast enough to keep up with the rate that the Earth's changing and that the biological patterns are changing. All right, so I'm just going to leave you with that question there. So how can sustainability help me, meaning that bird, so the common greenshank? So whether it be a bird, whether it be a fish, whether it be something else, whether it be an animal or plant that we as humans want to harvest because it's a food resource or it's something we use for building our houses, or whether it be an animal or plant that we just like to know is alive and exists and we don't want to go to extinction as the wader birds or as the dugongs and turtles are. Sustainability is about protecting those populations and making sure that they are still there when our children are the same age we are, and then hopefully even our grandchildren. So what can the biology and the principles and practices that we're learning through this course and others actually do so that you have tools that you can use to help the world, I guess, protect and live in a sustainable manner. So I'm going to leave you there. I've got a couple of videos I'm going to flip through, and then I'll give you a quick review and summary of the key points of the lecture. And hope you've enjoyed that. Hope one day in the future, maybe I'll see you guys at a Science Under Sail field trip. Okay, so hopefully now on your screen, you've got this baited underwater video footage. This is stuff that Science Under Sails collect. And I'm just showing you basically a seagrass habitat and letting you see the life that exists in the seagrass habitats that you often don't see when you're swimming there because we scare the fish away. So that's a squid up in the middle above the bait bag, and then obviously lots of other fish around. But I'm going to actually move on to another one. This was interesting. This is sped up, and this shows you the starfish and the crabs that think the bait bags are pretty good stuff, and another one just to show the mix of animals that we get in the seagrass meadows at different times. So hopefully those of you, if the video is working, will see a turtle coming in from the right of screen, checking the bait bag out, and then deciding there's nothing in it for him because he's a vegetarian, and so then heading off. But yeah, it's been great to have these videos look at how the seagrass meadows are used, and I just thought this brought together some of the different parts. So finally, this is the last one. You can see a little crab there heading over to the bait bag before something bigger decides that it would prefer. So. All right, well, on that note, I'll go back to just the review of the lecture. It was obviously about sustainability and how we enact sustainability on the earth to actually improve things for all humans, as well as other animals, I guess. The sustainability is about not any one group taking to the detriment of the others, I guess, in the shortest term. So on the left there, I've got some of the key issues that I hope I've covered, and that you might want to research to a greater depth to sort of build on this lecture. So the issues are that it's important to protect the habitat. So that means reducing pollution and managing not just the take or the harvest, but also the loss. And there's a good example that UQ researcher did that on dolphins or dugongs in Moreton Bay, looking at if we increase death rate just by one individual per year due to boat strike, where that potentially pushes the population to a decline to extinction rather than maintaining itself. So that's the other thing to think about, is how are human activities increasing the death rate of these animals, and is the birth rate or the rate of recruitment sufficient to sustain both natural loss as well as human-induced additional loss. So the other one's understanding, or sort of a building on that, is understanding of the life cycles of the animals that we're concerned about and that we want to ensure sustainable practices are being followed. And then thinking about cumulative impacts. I didn't talk specifically about that, but I touched on quite a lot of areas where the cumulative impact is. So it's really just thinking about all the things I've talked about in the lecture. The harvest, how many animals can you take out of a population each year before you've taken too many. But that's going to be impacted by how many individuals are added to a population through natural recruitment processes. How fast are the animals growing, and how long does it take for those animals to reach reproductive ages themselves? So understanding all those things, as well as what we're doing to the environment, enhancing the rate of growth of these animals, not affecting them at all, or is it declining their health and of the population? So is it taking longer for an animal to reach maturity or a certain size than it used to take? So on the right-hand side of the slide, you've got what are some of the solutions that we put in place with our different management organizations. So if you want to manage for sustainability, and often refer to it as ecosystem management, for sustainable ecosystem management, you have to look at your catchment runoff. So how much pollution are you putting into the waterways, and what impact is that having? You look at marine parks that try to manage holistically for the whole environment or the habitat, as well as the fisheries legislation that tends to focus just on managing for individual populations. And then you've got to ensure that the harm the population is mitigated. So it's not just the take. So the harvest is a taking where there's a beneficial use of the product, but all the other things that we're doing as humans that might be leading to an accelerated death rate. So ensure that that harm to the population is managed across all stages. So a good example of that in Moreton Bay is the go slow zones that they brought in to try to slow boats down where there's a lot of dugongs and turtles, because they found that the dugongs and turtles were being killed at a very high rate due to high-speed boats running over them. So that was not managing a fisheries thing, because nobody was harvesting turtles and dugongs to eat, but they were still killing them. And then finally, considering those cumulative impacts. And as a society and as a species, we're not brilliant at this, but we are trying to do this more and more, is that look at the multiple impacts that we're having across the life cycle of an animal, and ensure that that population can still sustain itself, even though we might be having 4, 5, or 10 different impacts at different points in the life cycle. So we might be affecting reproduction, we might be affecting recruitment, we might be affecting growth rates, and we're also likely to be affecting the harvesting and the take of the animal for our consumption or our benefit. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope you found the lecture interesting, and I've just put up there a few other resources from Science Under Sail if you're interested in following up with me. My email's down the bottom there. It's james@scienceundersail.com.au, and love to hear from you if you find what I've talked about interesting. Thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye.